Like you, I'm a toy collector. I grew up in the 80s, came of age in the 90s, and one of the fun things about being a toy collector is getting modern versions of toys we had as a kid. And this happens a lot these days because, well, there's only so many IP that toy companies are willing to bet on. And being able to complete a collection that you had as a child or wanted to have as a child, but with modern toys is really thrilling. Lots of fans and fan sites do this. I loved how when I was running the Motu Classics line, Whoosh would take the old He-Man cross-sell posters from the 80s and slowly populate them with the Classics toys, taking the place of the illustrated art. Perfect example of upgrading and showing how a modern version of toys is collected. Same thing with Superpowers. The Superpowers collection from Kenner, when I was at Mattel, we were very deliberate to do all of them in the DC Universe Classic and even released a cross-sell poster showing what they would look like, posed exactly like their vintage counterparts. So one line in particular that I collect, Marvel Legends X-Men figures, is never going to have this. Most likely. I think it's a pretty safe bet. Now, obviously, there was a vintage line that is being drawn on, that being the Toy Biz 1990's line. Huge influence on Marvel Legends and a huge influence on me buying Marvel Legends. So why is it that the 90s X-Men line will probably never be recreated in a modern collector line? Well, let's jump into that. So this toy line came out at kind of the height of the X-Men or the mutant characters' popularity, if you will, right when superstar artists like Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Wills Porcio were all working on them. And while the first wave of Toy Biz figures was based on the Pride of the X-Men pilot, later waves, including the X Force waves, which literally broke out of the X-Men on package, you could see the way the logo was used to show this was, a new breakout line, literally having the X Force logo popping out of the X-Men logo. But this line in particular tended to focus on characters based on speculation alone. Now, obviously, major characters from the comic and ones that showed up in X-Men animated series were no-brainers. Shatterstar, major character. Domino, female, but still major character. But we started getting characters that not only weren't in the animated series, okay, well, like Quark did show up in a long shot episode, but yeah, Kane, not so much. So who are these characters and why were they getting toys in the X-Men line if they're not appearing in the content and they're actually kind of fading from the comic books at the time? All right, so obviously the X-Men animated series became the key content driver for the Toy Biz line. It didn't start that way. It started off just as a comic book line, but it was the content that pushed it. What's unique about this line is it's one of the only toy lines that I can recall that made action figures and selected characters for inclusion based purely on hype and the promise of popularity. And this is especially true of the 90s characters and what was going on where the artists were more popular than the characters. It's a very unique moment in comicdom, and especially because Rob Liefeld, who sort of bubbled up to the top of the extreme 90s hot list, well, Toy Biz was basically on board that anything Rob Liefeld touched was going to be a gold mine and was worth investing tooling and product on shelf for. So this is a really unique perspective that really shaped this line. One thing that was noticeable was the number of cable variants and non-comic accurate cable variants. While you can do unlimited variants for certain characters, and really the quintessential success story is Batman because he's a gadget guy, it didn't so much work for Cable. Arctic Blast Cable, not so much. Even though Cable did make his own armor and weapons, it didn't translate into what's known as sort of the Batman variant concept that works, but only for certain characters. It was really the popularity of the artist, and in this case specifically Rob Liefeld, that was the driving force behind these characters. So let's look at some of them. X-Force line from Toy Biz included breakout characters like Gideon, who you are obviously a big fan of, right? Yeah, he lasted. Yeah, Gideon was kind of a, it was a businessman slash mutant that was introduced in the early 90s. I mean, he made it into the X-Men trading card series by Jim Lee, and he did share a first appearance with Deadpool and Domino, but yeah, Gideon hasn't exactly been a character that's had the long life or the recognition of Deadpool. And while his hair tends to fluctuate between green and white, getting an updated version of this character, whether he's got green or white ponytail hair, probably slim to none. He's kind of slipped off into obscurity. Same could be said for G.W. Bridge? The guy's name is actually George Washington Bridge. Like, I'm sorry. Come on, that's like really lazy naming. The guy's name is George Washington Bridge. Do we have a Brooklyn Bridge and does he have a sister named Bay? All right. Well, G.W. Bridge, George Washington Bridge, is a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent tasked with tracking down X-Force. While he did appear very briefly in the animated in, well, I guess a cameo with other members of S.H.I.E.L.D. and I guess that's War Machine there, well, he didn't exactly also have the lasting power, but under the pen of Rob Liefeld, hey, it was worth the risk because the hype was huge. Anything Rob Liefeld did was awesome. And the characters got even more obscure. Comcast. Well, Deadpool obviously was a breakout character, both in the toy line and in the comics, so any character that was associated with Deadpool, such as Comcast, who was one of the villains that Deadpool faced in his very first miniseries, but hasn't really had much of a life beyond this out in comic books. Yet he wound up with a key toy in the 1990s in the X-Men X Force line. In addition to Comcast, other Deadpool villains also were kind of fast-tracked because, yeah, again, if you're going to fight Deadpool, hey, why not? So same thing with Slayback. While he had a very cool action feature and had that kind of like yellow skin skeleton thing appearing to kids, his limited appearances in the comic and his sort of quick, I guess, leave of comics makes it very questionable, again, why this character wound up selected over more popular characters that were more enduring, longer lasting, or actually just translated to toys. Extreme, another example of, well, a perfect example of the extremeness of the 90s. This was a character that was part of the Extreme X-Men phase. First, I believe he was going to be a third Summers brother, but then that was dropped, and yeah, he's basically kind of gone the big A way. While he had his moment in the sun in the early 90s, and managed to squeeze out a toy to be, as the collectors say, immortalized in plastic, the chance of getting a new Extreme action figure in Marvel Legends, much like those Deadpool villains and Rob Liefeld creations, you really need ongoing content to be an action figure and to get recognized by the public. When this happens, yeah, the floodgates open and suddenly everyone knows who you are and it's more acceptable to make consumer product. Without dedicated content, just making a toy because the character is popular for a moment and the hype behind it is sort of, well, pumped to make these characters huge. The perfect example is the Externals, which was set to be the next major villain in X-Force, but this plot line and these characters didn't really get fleshed out the way they were intended. It was kind of like what Rob Liefeld left behind for Marvel before he left for greener pastures. The idea was the Externals were going to become a major thing, but Liefeld was off drawing Youngblood at this time, and the scripts that he'd left, while they were picked up by the new creative team, didn't have the impact, and without Rob Liefeld's name and pen behind them, the Externals never really went on to, I guess, fan favorites the way Toy Biz backed doing action figures of them, characters like Cruel and Killspree, who really have faded into obscurity. But because of the hype and because of the Rob Liefeld connection, Toy Biz was more than willing to bet on them and say, hey, we should absolutely be focusing on Externals because they're going to be the next major mutant villain. Not so much. It didn't really turn out that way. But when an action figure is made based on hype alone, it gives you really obscure characters. So getting all of our 90s X-Men in modern Marvel Legends, well, because of the focus on Rob Liefeld's creations and his leaving of Marvel in the middle of this toy line, well, it's likely that those obscure characters that came from his pen aren't going to make their way into Marvel Legends, and getting a modern version of the Toy Biz 90s line, likely not to happen. But hey, It's a long way to toydom. Anything can happen. I hope you enjoyed these videos, or this video, and it was an insightful look into the 90s X Force line and what made it so different. If you did enjoy it, please do share it with others. It's the best way to support this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.